Hello, everybody. This is Kiana Park from TAM Partners. I'm the facilitator for this webinar series. Welcome to Webinar 9 in our 12-part Transportation Asset Management webinar series sponsored by Federal Highways and AASHTO. The topic of today's webinar is Developing Transportation Asset Management Plans. Webinars are generally held every 2 months. However, our next webinar approaches to integrating risk into TAM programs and plans will be held on June 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a slightly longer break between webinars than usual, and that's to accommodate the upcoming 10th National Conference on Transportation Asset Management, sponsored by TRB, that will be held at the end of April. And the actual following this conference, there is going to be a series of webinars that will summarize the presentations that are made at the conference. So that's why we're skipping to the June date. To find more information on this webinar series, visit tam.transportation.org and click webinars. You'll find archives to previous webinars, and shortly we'll be adding today's video and slides. You can also link to this page from the Federal Highways Office of Asset Management site. Just on the phone logistics, we've entered the webinar into lecture mode. In lecture mode, you'll be muted by default, and only the presenters will be audible. And we just ask all of the presenters to use your phone's mute button to mute and unmute your phone in order to be heard. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Gay from Federal Highways.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's Federal Highway Administration, Office of Asset Management, in cooperation with the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, is pleased to present this webinar today. It's the 9th in our series of webinars on asset management, especially important as we move to implement the MAP 21 requirements. You all know MAP 21 requires that all state DOTs develop asset management plans for their pavements and bridges on the NHS. Federal Highway certainly encourages states to include other assets. Looking at the requirement for asset management plans in MAP 21, but even looking at the AASHTO guide, is just good asset management practice to develop an asset management plan. We thought it was important to have some good examples from the U.S. You know, we find the examples from abroad, but we often hear from states, well, what should I be doing? Well, those other countries are different, etc. We selected 3 states, and they're different in a number of ways. There's certainly some geographic diversity, different climates, sizes, and the urbanized issues are certainly different. The objective of this pilot project specifically was to help these 3 states develop their asset management plans, but in general to share information with all states on developing a plan. I always find interesting is the leads in the 3 states were different. In New York, came out of maintenance. In Minnesota, the lead initially was planning, and in Louisiana, initially was finance, but quickly pulled in other parts of the organization. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at MAP 21, it requires that an asset management plan includes an inventory, condition, looks at life cycle cost, risk, a financial plan, and then investment strategies that leads to a program of projects. And the key is managing the assets for the long term. So when saying performance targets, looking at the short and long term are important issues, particularly when you make those investment decisions. We ask you to visit the FHWA website for information about these pilot projects. The 3 states have been very engaged, and hopefully we'll even have some of the final draft stamps up there in the next month or so. Next slide, please. Just a reminder, follow up what Jana said a couple of moments ago. The National Conference on Asset Management will be taking place in about 6 weeks, April 28th through 30th in Miami, Florida. You all are encouraged to attend. Federal Highway, working with AASHTO, TRB, are pleased to, help sponsor this event. Thank you so much, Jana. Let me pass it back to you.
Thanks, Steve. All right, so today's presentations include 4 speakers on developing transportation asset management plans. Together, we'll explore the experience of state DOTs at the forefront in taking on these challenges. Presentations will highlight both successful approaches and some important lessons learned. Each of these presentations will focus on specific aspects of an agency's TAMP development journey. Our goal is to provide depth rather than broad brush understanding. We will also address some useful tools and key success factors that may be applicable to those who are just beginning the process of TAMP development. Presentations will highlight successful tools and approaches, key challenges overcome, significant benefits achieved, important lessons learned. Our learning objectives today, as mentioned previously, the purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, knowledge with the asset management community. For this webinar, the primary learning objectives are building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to developing transportation asset management plans, understanding specific approaches that the pilot agencies are taking to address these issues today, beginning to apply this knowledge in order to answer how can TAMP development improve coordination between maintenance, preservation, and the capital program? What benefits can states expect from formalizing in a TAMP the process of managing physical assets for the long term? What are the key lessons learned for agencies just beginning the process of TAMP development? For the agenda today, we started off by hearing from Steve. I will introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, our first presenter will be Michael Bridges of Louisiana DOTD. Next, we'll hear from New York State DOT with a presentation from Brad Allen. For our third presentation, we'll hear from Kirby Becker from Minnesota DOT. And our final presentation, I'll speak on a web-based tool that SIPON Partners is building for AASHTO to enable state DOTs to more easily develop a TAMP. And with that, we'll end with Q&A in the end. And just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar Q&A feature of the webinar menu bar anytime during today's presentation. And at the end, at the Q&A part, we'll just take it in the order that people have asked the question. Our first presentation is from Michael Bridges. Michael is the Undersecretary of the Office of Management and Finance in the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development. He served as the chair of the NCHRP 8-69 project panel that oversaw the development of the AASHTO Transportation Asset Management Guide, a focus on implementation. He also served as a member of the AASHTO and TRB Asset Management Committee. He chairs the AASHTO Subcommittee on Transportation Finance Policy and is a member of the FHWA Transportation Asset Management Expert Task Group. Michael is the executive champion for the Louisiana TAMP, and in that role, he has been providing executive-level support and assistance to Louisiana's TAMP steering committee, the TAMP co-leaders, and the asset management engineer to develop the TAMP. And now I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Juana. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Louisiana DOTD's experiences and not necessarily get into the TAMP that we're developing right now, but to kind of give everybody an idea of some of the things that you will experience as you build your own TAMP. The outline that I'm going to go through, we first had to get the crew together on how to, the crew that is needed to put the TAMP together, and then we had to answer some questions that were being asked, and mainly that we already do asset management. Why do we need another plan to maintain? Who's going to own it? And then at the very end, I'm going to talk a little bit about the need to be able to move forward quickly when you're developing your TAMP, because it does take a little bit longer than what you may think. Next slide. So getting the crew together. Next slide. We put together a steering committee back at the beginning of 2012. This was even before MAP 21 came out. I had been involved in a lot of the different committee and the AASHTO committee and the TRB asset management committees, and we knew that there was something going to be done in regards to requiring asset management. I think everybody was a little surprised that it actually got into MAP 21. I personally am pleasantly surprised that it was in there. So when it came out, when the MAP 21 requirements came out, we were already positioned in a very good place. The steering committee is made up of myself as the executive committee champion, and I included representatives from all over the department: maintenance systems, multimodal planning, data collection. The districts have representation, IT has representation, engineering, our research center, and then our strategic planning group. Next slide. But we did realize that it's kind of hard to get a large committee focused, and the more people we have on it, the little bit more difficult it is to get the task done. So we boiled it down to a core working team. I've been involved. We have our data collection and analysis section that is really taking the main lead. They're co-chairing this with statewide operations, and then we actually created a position and filled it, a position called the asset management engineer, which is going to report to the data collection and analysis section head, which is in multimodal planning. So we've put together the governance, and I have a slide at the very end that we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Part of our core working team also included an outside consultant, Dive Management. We brought them on about the September time frame because we realized that we needed to have more help in extracting the information out of our organization. We also are using or relying on the Federal Highways pilot consultant, Cambridge and AMEC. Next slide. So when we were getting started with this, we had to answer the question, well, but we're already doing asset management. And at LADOTD, we are. LADOTD has a robust, state-of-the-art pavement and bridge management system. We do condition assessments on pavements every 2 years. Bridges are assessed every 2 years at a minimum. Predictive modeling for various funding scenarios. We do that to help build our budget. And we're able to provide a level of service for the network. We feel like we're doing very good asset management. Next slide. And our pavement system, we have DTIMS, which is a Dayton tool. We have a lot of other systems that we're using for pavement management. Next slide. And same thing with bridges. We're using the AASHTO bridge management software, and we have a legacy homegrown software that we're using to support our national bridge inventory requirements. So in essence, we are doing good asset management, and it's important to make sure your people know that. Next slide. So then we have to talk about, well, why another plan to maintain? Next slide. Well, mainly, asset management, a risk-based asset management plan is required under MAP 21. And it requires a summary listing of all your pavement and bridge assets on the NHS. asset management objectives and measures, performance gap identification, life cycle cost and risk management analysis, a financial plan and investment strategies, and all of these things are required in the legislation, but they're all really something that you need to do anyway to have good asset management. Next slide. And also, you want to be able to answer the core questions about your assets. What is the current state of my assets? What are my current levels of service and performance delivery? Which assets are critical to sustain performance delivery? What are my best investment strategies for operations, maintenance, replacements, and improvement? And what is my best long-term funding strategy? Next slide. And you also need to understand that in developing a TAMP, it's really not going to replace the other plans that DOTs are required. In my opinion, it's more of a policy document. It's not intended to replace the other plans. It must influence all the other plans, and it's going to make sure that it's going to bring forward the importance of data sources to support your TAMP. And we are going to revise our TAMP on a cycle. It's probably going to be annually, but updating our financial plan maybe every other year, actually going into the TAMP itself and revising it. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the governance structure and who owns it, because that's one of the first things that our people were asking. Well, where are we going to locate the responsibility for the TAMP? So we do have support for the TAMP, the executive champion, the steering committee that I mentioned earlier. The asset management engineer is located in the Office of Multimodal Planning, Data Collection Analysis. But even so, the asset management engineer does not have any direct supports. He will have to manage the TAMP by influence. Next slide. As I mentioned, the TAMP is not going to replace the other plans. It's going to link to the other plans. And this is a diagram that came from the AASHTO Asset Management Guide. And it does show that it's right in the middle of all your other plans. It's I said earlier, a policy document. Basically, you've got all these other plans that are out there. Sometimes they don't work together. Sometimes they do. Sometimes people are following the plan. Sometimes they aren't. The TAMP is basically saying that you are going to run your business like this, like it's being said in all of your plans, and it's going to have a mechanism to where you can make sure that people are following those plans. It's a policy document. Next slide. Our governance structure of course, starts off with the secretary, and the Office of Multimodal Planning reports to the secretary. Data collection analysis reports to the Office of Multimodal Planning. And then you've got asset management, and that's the asset management engineer in there, right in the middle. And they are going to be managing through influence to all of those different groups that you see the dotted lines. And that basically, they're going to be managing through influence to the rest of the department. And they will have to have executive support to do that, obviously. And that's where the executive champion comes in. But it's going to be a case where you're going to have an owner of the plan, which is the asset management engineer, but you're going to have a lot of input from all the other plans and the rest of the department. Next slide. So the point of this section is don't wait and start your plan right now. The next slide. Our plan has 8 chapters in it. Starting off with asset inventory and conditions, management objectives, performance gap, life cycle costs, risk management, financial plan, investment strategies, and our process improvements. We started working with the Federal Highways consultant on this 3-state pilot back in, I guess it was late spring of 2013, and here we are basically a year later, and we're not quite through with it. It does take a level of effort to be able to work with your people to get the information to put it into your plan, because there's a lot of a lot of things that have to be done. There's a lot of information that has to be extracted, and it does take some time. So I guess the message is that start now, because the clock's ticking. Next slide. Some of the things that we've learned is that in talking with certain experts within our department, it's hard. I mean, they're talking what I call engineering ease. They expect you to understand their lingo. They expect you to be at their level of understanding. They're short-staffed and are pulled in many directions at once. Sometimes they lack the patience and time to deal with, the novice that's trying to investigate and understand. But it does help sometimes to have those novice eyes on that information and those charts to make sure that they're understandable, because our TAMP, one of the goals is to have it written in layman's terms so that we could use this as a means of communicating how we are managing our assets and that we are using the money in the best place. Next slide. So our time frame, as I said, we formed our steering committee in April. We started the pilot in February. We've been doing a lot of workshops. We hired our own internal consultant in September. We have just this month delivered most of the tasks to the Federal Highways consultant to have them start putting it together. And our goal is to get this a good draft together before the asset management conference, and hopefully we can get it done at the first part of April, because I want to be able to have time to go through it, and we want to get it out there to Federal Highways so they can start reviewing it. So we are working hard at this point to get it out the door. Next slide. And that is my presentation, and I will turn it back to Luana.
Thank you, Michael. Our next presentation from Brad Allen of New York State DOT addresses New York State DOT's TAMP. Brad is the project manager for developing NISTOP's TAMP. Brad has worked on various asset management and maintenance management projects at NISTOP for the last 9 years. He's a member of the Transportation Asset Management Expert Task Group, and Brad is chair of the TRB Subcommittee on Asset Management Implementation. And now I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thanks, Shanna. I'll be focusing on 2 lessons we learned in developing our TAMP. We are right now in the final stages of internal review before we go to external review. The first lesson is something we did well, which saved us some time in the development, which was involving our CEO early on at the end of the planning process. And the second was a lesson we learned the hard way, which was to get whoever your primary editor author is going to be involved early in the process of compiling your materials. So developing a TAMP, to repeat what Michael said, is a long process. We found there are things we could do along the way to shorten it some by working more efficiently. So this says 3+ months to plan with any project. Good planning is essential. Once you have your plan in place, to be efficient, your team will need to work for a number of months fairly autonomously, so you're not going back to your leadership for approval of each decision along the way. This was about a 5-month process for us, as you can see there. And then finally, we've been in about 5 months of drafting, editing, and reviewing, which hopefully we'll be finishing up in the next couple of weeks. CEO providing a detailed review and sign-off of the work plan enabled our team to work for about 6 to 8 months without having to go back to her for further direction. It gave us an eye on the big picture in the beginning to save time in the end when we're compiling and documenting the TAMP. So to get into that a little bit, our CEO's decision to review and approve our work plan was a big time saver, both during the development, since we did not need to get executive approval for each decision along the way, and also during review. When we delivered the first draft for executives to review, we were able to say to them, everything in the work plan is in the draft, and everything that's in the draft was in the work plan. This reduced the review to how the material is to be presented, not a discussion of why this material was included in the plan. So what's in a work plan and why is it so important? And why should your CEO be familiar with it? On the surface, these things, an outline, description of your materials, detailed list of deliverables, and your plan for each stage of the process, seems a little detailed for a CEO, but really our work plan was less than 20 pages, and the CEO really doesn't need to see that detailed list of deliverables. What was important was an outline and a list of material to be included, and within that list, a description of how each topic was to be covered. So as you compile your work plan, you'll be answering some basic questions. What assets do we manage and are we going to include in our TAMP? Do we own all of these assets that we manage, or are we part of a larger planning partnership? What are our anticipated resources? How do we go about making decisions? What risks exist and how do we expect to deal with them? What are our priorities and strategies moving into the future? What are our targets and goals? What are our future conditions expected to be? And how can we get better at all this over time? Each of these questions presents issues that your CEO will want to at least be aware of. If not, and preferably early on, set direction for. For each executive, a different question may give them a little heartburn. It's important to know which ones that will happen for yours. Make sure they're familiar with and in agreement with not only the planned content, but how you expect to present that material. That was very key for us and it worked well. How, as an example, how will you discuss the need for resources? Are conditions improving or declining? These are examples of some things that will have to be handled very specifically in the TAMP. At the time of the work plan, some of this may not be known. For example, you may not have a risk register or risk mitigation strategies, but your chief executive will want to be aware early on of the decisions that he or she will need to make later in the process. At NYSDOT, we leveraged the Federal Highways pilot project for consultant support, and the consultants were our primary writer. This was mentioned earlier. So what I'm getting into is certainly not a knock on the support we received. We are in fact thrilled with the service we received from the consultants and FHWA on this project, and the New York State Thruway Authority all contributed and were all fantastic. We could not have developed our TAMP without them and are very grateful. But I want to go through some lessons that, just because of the way we organized ourselves and were set up, how things ended up falling out, and where, if we had it to do over again, maybe things would be organized a little bit differently. Our primary author really didn't begin drafting anything until all of our materials were compiled. So that was from June to November. And in November, we handed over what was really a compilation of all the bits and pieces from structures, planning, et cetera, to the consultant. And we referred to it, once we had it all together, as the Franken document. It was very disjointed. It followed what was the letter of our outline for the TAMP, but it didn't flow. It was written in multiple voices. It just wasn't a solid document. It ended up, because of that, and through a heroic effort on the part of our consultants, taking about 2 months to get a draft that we felt was worthy of executive review. In that time, we did have review from FHWA headquarters that was very beneficial. And it's taken another month since that executive review to prepare a draft we felt was ready for our commissioner's review, which just happened 2 days ago. There's some reasons for this. This is a representation of our team that we put together. This is a team of technical experts. You're going to need to get the people who know these subjects inside and out. You'll want them to have diverse knowledge, experience, and talents. And it's essential that you have a primary author or editor, at least, who is involved early on to compile the materials in a single voice and tell a coherent narrative. Each member of our team, and likely of any team, is going to be an expert in one or a few subjects. What this tends to mean is that each thinks that their subject is the most important, and they're going to present the material that way. They're also going to present material in what I found to be astounding detail. And in most cases, and I'll include myself in this, as technical folks, we're used to presenting to an internal audience. So having someone who's used to writing for an external audience in your primary writer-editor role be very important. So with that, the role needs to be filled by a writer, not necessarily another technical expert. They should be familiar with how DOTs work and, if possible, familiar with your specific department. All of the nuances of how things get done will be drawn out in putting a TAMP together. In many cases, different parts of the agency speak their own language. In some cases, they may use the same term to mean different things. An example in New York was the measure backlog. This was calculated differently for pavements and bridges. So what looked on the surface to be a comparison of apples to apples was really apples to watermelons in our case. It's important that your project lead or project manager be able to work with that primary editor, writer, to draw these differences out, because they won't be obvious on the surface. The process of gathering the information is more analogous, we found, to mining than turning on a tap. You can't just sit down with each team member and expect all the needed information to come pouring out. You'll need to chip away with questions to reveal the material that you're after. Once you've mined that material, it's up to the writer-editor to craft it into something useful in the TAMP. It would be good for this role to be involved early in the discussions with the chief executive that we talked about a minute ago. This way they're aware of what will be of the most concern later on during the review process. The less familiar this individual is with your agency and your CEO's specific concerns, the more editing will be needed once the draft is delivered. This person will not necessarily deliver any material themselves. It's really, we found to be a unique role on the team. Instead, they will need to thread together all the material everyone else brought. Find instances where what is being delivered does not match the outline, and bring that to the project manager's attention. In some cases, the material may be adjusted to fit the outline. In other instances, you may have identified a flaw in your outline. In extreme cases, you may need to adjust your work plan, which will mean getting the attention of your asset management champion and maybe even the CEO. It's best to know this as early as possible so that it doesn't bring your whole project to a halt while you address one issue later on. We were lucky enough in New York not to run into those, but it's very foreseeable. So just in summary, while we feel a project has been very successful and we're very satisfied with the TAMP that we have nearly completed developing, the reviewing and editing took much longer than we expected it to. And I see the lack of involvement of a primary role of a writer early on as the main reason for that. However, we were fortunate enough to have some attention from our commissioner very early on in the process to give us good, clear direction, and I feel that actually saved us quite a bit of time in the developing of the materials. That is mine, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Brad. And just a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions of any of our speakers, just use the Q&A features at the top of your menu bar to enter those questions. Our next presentation is from Minnesota DOT. Kirby Becker is a planning director in the Office of Transportation System Management at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. He is the project manager for MnDOT's first risk-based transportation asset management plan. Prior to his role on the TAMP, Kirby served as project manager for MnDOT's 20-year statewide transportation plan, which establishes guidance and priorities for state transportation decisions. Kirby has 15 years of transportation planning and project and program management experience. Prior to joining MnDOT, Kirby worked for the St. Cloud Metropolitan Planning Organization, Parsons Transportation, and Carter and Burgess. Kirby is going to speak to us about Minnesota's TAMP, and now I'll turn it over to Kirby.
Thanks, Gianna. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, I just want to say great job, Brad, highlighting some of the challenges of this TAMP development process. As part of my presentation today, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the general process that we've gone through in terms of who's been involved and the scope of MnDOT's TAMP, followed by a few minutes highlighting our progress and what's left until we get a final plan. And then finish up, I'm taking a little bit different direction. I'm gonna pull one of the pieces out of the TAMP and really talk about getting into the specifics of one of the key elements in the TAMP, and that being life cycle cost considerations, providing more specific details about how we kind of came about life cycle cost considerations, what were some of the assumptions and inputs, and the results, specifically highlighting pavement and bridge. Next slide. So just a couple of minutes talking about our TAMP process and it being a cooperative effort. In the beginning, very similar to both New York and Louisiana, we formed a TAMP steering committee, which contained broad representation from around the department. It included investment planning. We have a specific office on performance measures. We have a policy planning unit, a data and analysis unit. We've got folks from maintenance and operations, our materials folks, bridge. We have specific staff that are really in tune with risk, our finance office, our Minnesota districts, greater Minnesota districts, and then lastly, our Minnesota Federal Highway Division office was also part of that steering committee. Aside from the steering committee meetings that we had several workshops throughout the development of the TAMP, one on life cycle costs, several on risks, and then another one to talk about our financial plan, thinking about what are the targets or measures that we're setting and moving forward with our enhancements within the TAMP. As part of those workshops, we invited our executive management, and they were very critical or crucial in helping us make those decisions moving forward. There was a smaller set of the steering committee called the project management team, and they met more frequently and had more of an active role in gathering information and managing the TAMP project. Next, we had work groups. we went a little bit further in our first asset management plan beyond pavement and bridge and included several other assets. And so we formed work groups around kind of asset categories. And those 4 categories were pavement, bridge, other traffic structures, and hydraulics. I'm going to get into that here in the next couple of slides of what the specific assets were that we included. So those work groups comprised of subject matter experts, and each work group had a specific lead to kind of follow through the planning process. The day-to-day operations are being led by myself along with Mark Nelson and Matt Malika from our office, along with our consultant APTEC. And this, all of our work is being done in close coordination with Federal Highways Asset Management Office and their pilot consultant, AMAC. Next slide. So map 21, you heard Steve mention earlier that TAMPs are required to look at pavement and bridge on the National Highway System. MnDOT expanded the scope of this initial effort to include bridges and pavements on our entire trunk highway system, as well as several other asset types, and you can see those on the slide here, highlighted in yellow. Centerline culverts, deep stormwater tunnels, which are very large tunnels underneath the Twin Cities metropolitan area that drain a lot of the stormwater. Overhead sign structures, and last, high mast tower lighting. Next slide. Now just a few minutes on kind of our TAMP progress, and then I'll move into the life cycle. So next slide. Similar to the other states, we have one more chapter. Michael had mentioned that Louisiana has 8 chapters. We have actually included the last chapter called Process Enhancements, and that chapter is really about the gaps in the data that you find throughout your planning process. If you don't have enough information on deterioration rates, you know that you're going to have to conduct some additional research to collect that information. This is where that information gets laid out, as well as talking about the risks that you identify in your plan and the mitigation strategies moving forward and how you're going to actually move forward with those in some sort of a priority. MnDOT's TAMP for consistency will roughly correspond to the MAP 21 summary outline. Next slide. A little bit more about progress. With the help of our project steering committee and work groups, we compiled an asset register, as you see a small piece of it here on the slide, containing everything from inventory numbers, their condition of the inventory, and other related information on each specific TAMP asset, such as replacement value. And you can see that to the far right. Next slide. Then, as part of the TAMP development, there were a series of work group meetings and several workshops to identify and prioritize undermanaged asset risks that could impact our department's ability to achieve performance objectives. Risks were prioritized using a structured elicitation method, and that's shown here on the slide, followed by the identification of appropriate mitigation strategies and costs that would reduce the likelihood and consequence of a risk occurring if implemented. And you can kind of see along the top the likelihood, and on the left side the consequence ratings there as you go through the risk assessment. Next slide. MnCHIP, our 20-year state highway investment plan, essentially outlines investment levels and performance targets for pavement and bridges. And that's shown kind of on the slide. You see the pie chart. We have our financial breakdown for the first 10 years within our state highway investment plan. And on the right, you have 10-year targets that were identified in that state highway investment plan. But also part of the TAMP was a gap assessment where we've been developing similar risk-based performance targets for the other assets to determine future need and investment strategies, and those will be worked into the plan as well, as well as future chapters in the plan, the financial plan and the investment strategies. Next slide. Now I'm going to get into kind of pulling out one of the pieces and how we started and where we ended up or where we finished, and that's specifically focusing on life cycle costs. So why don't we just kind of get into that. Next slide. So before we get into the information and how we collected it and where we ended up, I wanted to show this slide because I really like this life cycle cost iceberg graphic that we created because it's very telling. It shows the whole story. Investments in transportation assets is not just about the initial investment. It's not what you see above the water. It's the total cost of owning an asset throughout its usable life. And that includes not just the initial capital expenditure, but also future capital, maintenance costs, and operational costs. And many times, those that are in the industry know that the sum of the last three many times often greatly exceeds that of the initial capital costs. So as part of the TAMP, life cycle analysis was completed for each of the assets that you saw on the previous slide. Next slide. So how was life cycle cost analysis completed for MnDOT's draft TAMP today? It was done by collecting asset deterioration information to the best of our knowledge, inspection data, treatment cycles and costs, and then modeling that data and determining optimal life cycle strategies. On the slide, you'll see below each main bullet is a pavement example or question of kind of how we collected that information working with the work groups. This life cycle approach was used for each of our TAMP assets. The major difference between pavement, which you see the examples here on the slide, and the other assets was the ability to collect treatment cycle information for quote-unquote desired, and you'll see that as we get in to future slides. So the result is a life cycle analysis that compares typical, desired, and worst first for pavement in our draft, and a typical and worst first for the remaining assets. Next slide. So on the screen is a table that highlights full depth reclamation or a reconstruction strategy. So after we collected all of the right information from our work groups, we were able to develop pavement strategies, and this specifically is for flexible pavements. On the next slide, I'm going to kind of highlight a mill and overlay strategy. And the costs here that you see here and on the next slide are shown in cost per lane mile. So aside from the specific life cycle information that we collected that was highlighted on the previous slide, some of the model inputs and assumptions included looking at an analysis period of 70 years, using a discount rate of 2.2%, only including agency costs into the life cycle cost analysis model, including both inspection costs and routine and reactive maintenance into the life cycle analysis. And then lastly, looking at our system and determining how much is rigid or concrete pavements versus bituminous or flexible pavements, identifying separate treatment cycles and costs for each of those, and then combining them into one composite value based on weighted averages of each. Next slide. If we could just back up one slide to the mill and overlay. I just wanted to highlight that we did a very similar exercise after we collected the information for the mill and overlay. So we had full depth reclamation and mill and overlay. Next slide. And so here are a couple of pie charts that take the information on those tables, and it really kind of sums the information. And these are the typical costs, so it's the average These two pie charts illustrate the typical costs for each of the strategies that were shown on the previous slides 13 and 14, and the savings between a desired or full-depth reclamation or reconstruction approach versus a typical mill and overlay approach is approximately $300,000 over the modeled life of the life cycle analysis for a lane mile of pavement. So, important. Next slide. Now, if we take the information that you've kind of heard and seen on the last three slides, this graphic takes the tabular strategy information and it puts it more into a graphical or visual format. Looking at all the lines that kind of go up and down, the negative slope in this figure shows deteriorating conditions for pavement. And a vertical jump in the condition depicts a treatment where a treatment's being applied. You'll notice specifically looking at how MnDOT is doing in achieving optimal life cycle investments, you'll notice that the first 20 to 25 years that the blue line and the red dashed line, which are specifically the typical and desired, are very, very close. That means that we're doing a very good job in investing in optimal life cycle costs. And then beyond 25, you can see that the spread is ever increasing between typical and desired. And that's likely due to tight and diminishing budgets and the need to kind of balance trade-offs between competing priorities such as meeting state and federal performance targets. Next slide. Not really specifically focusing on the detail of the numbers here. This is the results of the pavement life cycle analysis. MnDOT's current policy results in a savings of approximately 58% of future life cycle costs when compared to the worst first strategy. This is a savings of about $570,000 per lane mile of pavement, or approximately $16 billion over the entire inventory when you kind of break out the numbers and look at the statistics. Next slide. So, not getting into as much detail for the bridge, we collected the same information. Here's some of the treatment and cost information that was collected for bridges, specifically bridge decks. This type of information was also collected for the substructures and superstructure elements. And then we modeled it using the Markov model for deterioration. Next slide. Again, similar to pavement, as I mentioned earlier, we do not have a desired approach for the bridges, and that's we understand that we have gaps in data and information, and we've identified those in enhancements. This pie chart illustrates typical life cycle costs for all three bridge elements summed together, and is a representative average for all the bridges, both small and large. And so I want to make the important note that this is an average, and understanding that bridges can vary immensely in cost. Next slide. So here's the results of the bridge life cycle cost analysis. And even when future costs are discounted, MnDOT's current policy saves about 37% of future life cycle costs, which is a savings of about $450,000 per bridge, or $581 million over the entire inventory. So the key takeaway from this is small investments in improved asset management can really have a significant effect or return on your assets. Next slide. So, kind of in closing, I guess as we move forward here in Minnesota, MnDOT will have a completed TAMP. We're anticipating in mid-April sometime. Our agency will continue to enhance our business practices and processes as identified in the TAMP, and use the information that we have to influence our next state highway investment plan as well as our highway system operations plan, which is really focused on maintenance and operation budgets for the next 4 years. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby. Okay, let's move on to the final presentation for this webinar. I'm going to be speaking about a tool that has been built through the NCHRP Project 836 program. It's project number 116. And this is a project that was initiated by the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management, where they wanted to try to come up with a way to make it easier for state DOTs to develop their TAMP, so that the initial hurdle of getting started would make it based on knowledge that was gained from other efforts. So let's get started. Next slide. So the result of this project is a tool called the TAMP Builder, and it's basically a knowledge management tool that is designed to help make it easier for states and MPOs or any entity that's building a TAMP to use past TAMPs that have been completed to build their TAMPs more efficiently. So, the kind of the database that sits underlying this tool are existing TAMPs. Next slide. So how can you use this TAMP Builder? You can find examples of specific TAMP chapters that meet the needs of your TAMP that you want to build, meaning you know that you want certain sections of your TAMP, and you can actually search existing TAMPs to look at what other states or other agencies throughout the world have done to develop that chapter of their TAMP. The other is can I actually identify a TAMP that was developed by a peer agency so that you can have a model for an existing TAMP that you start with. So a lot of times when I think we heard today that getting a group of disparate people together and working together to develop your TAMP has some challenges, and in some ways having a model to start with so that you can more quickly focus in on what are the parts that you have issues that need further attention versus you're aligned, makes it easier when you have something on the table to look at. And then the final piece, which is the original intent of the project, was to find a basic outline that you can build using this tool for your TAMP so that you have a kind of a guidance document that will help walk you through the development of your actual TAMP document. Next. So let's dive in. This is the screen you would get when you come to the builder, and it gives you several options. And I'm just going to walk you through the 3 different objectives of how you can use this tool. So finding an example of TAMP chapters, you can actually go into the tool itself and you get this kind of a search document where you would enter your information about, so that what the tool does is actually produce an outline in a PDF form, and it gets emailed to you, and you use that document to actually find the resources you're seeking. So on the left column, it shows you the basic chapters of the minimum TAMP, and we right now the chapters are based on the pilot project. After the rules come out, this list will be revisited and updated to reflect the actual rules. And then on the right side, what you see where there are the check marks are optional sections that many states and international agencies have used in their TAMP development, so you can actually check off which sections you would like to add to the minimum outline for a TAMP. Next slide. And so then what the TAMP will do is it will actually develop this PDF file. It will email it to you, and you will get a file like this where it shows your agency name with an outline. It will have basic guidance, but then what it will do is what you see in the bottom of the screen there are links to existing TAMPs where you can go to specific sections of a TAMP, and it will show you what was written. And we can imagine that you would actually, copy-paste those and put it as a starting point, or you could just look at it as guidance so that you can use that to share with your committee that's developing the TAMP. This is how State X developed their TAMP, and this is the specific chapter we're working on right now and what that looks like. Next. So then another way is you want to actually look for models of TAMP that full TAMPs that other peer agencies have done. And here this is kind of a faceted search where you go into the tool and you decide, are you going to have highways only in your TAMP, or is that what you care about, or multimodal? And the asset scope now has either at a minimum bridges and pavements as required by MAP 21, or you could choose that you want to look at TAMPs that have other assets as well. And then in the agency location, right now we have 15 international TAMPs and 5 U.S. TAMPs. All of the U.S. TAMPs are ones that were developed pre-MAP 21. All of the pilot projects, and there are several other states who are developing TAMPs right now. None of them are ready to be shared through this. We're waiting for people to go through the official approval process. But as soon as those approvals have been met, then they will come into this tool. So then you'll be able to see which TAMPs are the ones that match your situation. You can select different sections of TAMPs that you want in there that are must sections. And then the publication date here is where, let's say in a few months, when we have the 6 TAMPs that are currently almost ready to be released for sharing. If you put in that they were developed in the recent years, then you'll be only getting those TAMPs that were developed after MAP 21 has been developed and then has been issued. And then, Terry, can you go back to the previous screen? Yeah, and on the additional criteria, you can also state, criteria like it presents a corridor view, includes an assessment of data quality and reliability. So it has multiple other factors that you can check off that match what your agency is interested in. And so then you would, on the right side, what it shows as you put more constraints on your search, the right side highlights the TAMPs in the database that actually meet your criteria. So you can kind of narrow in on which TAMP is most like your state situation. So you can see here that it's narrowed to the 3. And so next. So then when you click on a TAMP link, you would get this kind of screen, which will show the actual cover of the document itself, and then the criteria that you selected that matches that, and then you can actually have the external link that takes you to the document itself. And here you'll see, here's another one. So the 3 that match the criteria that were selected for the one we're using as the example now are shown here. All right, so then the most important part of this tool is to help an agency develop their TAMP outline and use the tool to get started in the development of their TAMP. And so you'll see here that you can go to a basic outline to get started, which is to select that, and then that's the MAP 21 minimum outline. And then what you will get is a PDF that has that outline in a PDF format. Now, we had a lot of dialogue about making it available in Word, but there were some people who felt that Microsoft Word has so many different variations that a PDF was the easiest way, and that you can always convert that to Word, and we have made it very straightforward for that conversion. But the most important part of it is at the beginning of every outline, there's a very simple guidance on each of the sections that are in the version of the TAMP you selected, and then following each of the sections, what it will do is have links to those chapters in the TAMP that match your condition. It will also, where there's a very valuable resource, like for instance, in the area of asset valuation, it's one of the best resources that we found is one asset valuation guidance that the UK has developed. The link to that document will be in this PDF file. You can click on it. It will take you to that document. And then also in the various sections, as I showed before, you can click to that section of all the TAMPs that match your criteria, and you can find that and look at, how 5 different agencies approach the development of that section to say which section best reflects the level of detail we're likely to want, or you can use it to share with your asset management committee how you want to move forward with that. Okay, so basically the tool is just at this stage we're hoping to get all of the recently developed TAMPs into the database, and right now the constraint on that is states want to make sure that they have their senior management approve it for release and sharing with everyone. The tool will be demoed at the Asset Management Conference at the end of April. We'll have, I think it's in one of the sessions, but we'll also have it available at the help desk of the conference, and Terry will be there showing demos, and people can come and kind of play with it. It's very straightforward and very easy to use. And then the tool will be available through the AASHTO website. And the idea is, as all of you develop your TAMP, they'll be added to the base, and there'll be a richer array of resources for everyone to share. Next. All right, so we are now in the question and answers part, so please ask any questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. So let's start with the first question from Christopher DeVernio. So his question is, has the asset management engineer had difficulties performing his or her duties? If so, please describe. I think this is a question for Michael.
Yeah, I had mentioned that in my spreadsheet, in my presentation, that we created an asset management engineer. And what was the question again regarding that?
Has the asset management engineer had difficulties performing his or her duties? If so, describe it, please.
Well, we were lucky to have somebody apply and get selected for the position that's got 30-plus years with the department, that knows a lot of knows a lot about the department. brings a lot of experiences from both the maintenance side and the IT side, and also with our asset management systems. As far as difficulties that he's had, he's carrying the ball to get this TAMP finished. So I believe that I could probably say that his biggest difficulty right now is getting all these pieces together to get to the FHWA consultant so that they can start putting it all together.
Thanks, Michael. Our next question is from Margaret Selwoff. How did MnDOT select the other assets to include? What was the prioritization process? Kirby?
Thanks, Jenna. That's a good question. About a year ago, or a year before we actually formed a steering committee, we've been kind of moving in this asset management direction for some time now. And I guess just to kind of set the stage to the question is, in 2011 we had a business plan that identified asset management moving forward and almost replicates what is kind of being said in MAP 21. And so we've been kind of moving in this asset management direction, and we had a committee that was formed prior to our TAMP pilot project and the steering committee, and they went through kind of a risk assessment and analyzing data that was available for each of the assets. And so it was kind of a combination of the information that we have available for the assets, as well as the importance in terms of setting condition and investments for each of the assets.
Thanks, Kirby. The next question is for you as well, from William Johnson. Why do you still use good, fair, poor for structures, and have you considered going to a structurally deficient measure?
Can you repeat that question?
Why do you still use good, fair, poor for structures, the measure for structures, and have you considered going to a structural deficient measure?
Well, that's our condition rating for structures, but what feeds into that is a very detailed model that comes out of our BRIM system, where it's looking at structurally deficient, as well as there's several other criteria that are fed into how we identify whether a structure is good, fair, or poor. But for purposes of trying to make it readable or producing a TAMP that is understandable or readable for everyone, that's kind of why we go with the good, fair, and poor. But those numbers are actually developed looking at structurally deficient.
William, I also wanted to just say that I was working with the Standing Committee on Performance Management's National Performance Measures Task Force, and there was a lot of discussion about moving away from structurally deficient bridges as a measure and moving more towards good, fair, poor, and that would be a more asset management oriented measure, that the structurally deficient is more worst first oriented. All right, the next question is from Chris. Are there recommended activities that are most effectively handled by state DOTs before bringing in a consultant to complete the TAM? So I guess this is a question for all of the panelists.
This is Michael. I'll kick this off. I think that my suggestion would be to put together a steering committee and a core group that is going to be the ones that are going to drive the development of the TAMP. And you shouldn't necessarily expect that outside consultant to be able to do that for you. They're not going to know much about your organization. They're going to be more of a resource to help you facilitate meetings and gather information and put it into some sort of a format that you can start building your TAMP. I would say what you need to do now is to start thinking about developing your own internal steering committee and your support structure.
I would echo what Michael just said about pulling together the right folks before you get started. But also think about, as a transportation agency, many of us have a lot of the documentation that's already being described in MAP 21 in various plans and documents that have been produced across our agencies. For instance, at MnDOT we have, as I mentioned in our presentation, we have a statewide statewide highway investment plan that looks out 20 years. We also have a highway system operations plan. We have a performance report that highlights how we're doing from year to year. Those are three examples of documents where we have a lot of the right critical information that's being asked for in MAP 21, and it's just a lot of it is a matter of just pulling the right pieces together. So I think that's important before you get started, is to kind of lay out and think about what you have that's available, and that will help if you decide to go the route of hiring a consultant, laying that out for them so that they can best utilize what you've already done.
Brad, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said, so I'll expand on that a little bit. I think there's two roles that the consultants filled for us. The first was, there's the facilitator role, and that's good, but really what it is your subject matter expert for the things that your department doesn't know about yet. So, for example, risk was very new to us. We didn't really know how to even get started. So the consultant was able to say, well, here's how a couple state DOTs have done it. Here's some information from ISO. Here's some information from some international asset management plans. Let's set up a workshop. We'll try and get the right people in the room and work through this. So, and then there is the step of, for us, although it doesn't have to be a consultant, as the primary editor, writer of the TAMP. I would say whoever's going to fill either of those roles, both of those roles, should be on pretty early. You're going to want a steering committee. Then as you say, okay, we're going to kick off development of the TAMP, you're going to want to have very specific project roles. You know, a project lead and a project manager, and at that point, you're going to want to have those other roles identified and in the mix so that you can lay out what are our objectives for the TAMP, and then start to put your outline together. So I see these as primary roles that need to be very early in the process.
Our next question is from Satvinder Sanju, and the question is, if I understand it correctly, Minnesota had a performance plan similar to a typical TAMP. If so, did you find it challenging to move into developing the TAMP? Kirby?
To answer the first part of the question, yes. Our 20-year state highway investment plan, which was just completed in December of 2013, basically includes a good majority of what's being requested in MAP 21. So we found it, the second part of the question, we found it very easy as a starting point to use that, especially when it comes to talking about the performance piece and what do we want to set for targets, 10-year targets for pavement and bridge on the NHS system. Those were already identified. It was just a matter of vetting those through our steering committee to make sure that they were on board with that, or if they wanted to potentially modify. But it was a good starting point for us.
Thank you. Our next question is from Lacey Love. It's a question for federal highways. What is the schedule for the NPRM for asset management plans and for the national goals and performance management measures for MAP 21? Astron, are you on?
Yes, I am. Will you please repeat the question?
So the question is, what is the schedule for the release of the NPRM for the asset management plan and also for the performance, the national performance measures for MAP 21?
Yes. the schedule is posted on the website of the Office of Secretary's Office. So we are scheduled for May. As far as performance management, for payments and bridges, I think that they are scheduled for later, and I don't have the information right now, but as I said, it's posted on the website of the Office of Secretary. But we have been scheduled for May, and we are hoping that it's going to be released then.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Dave Berridge. Did you have challenges with integrating local NHS roadways into your TAMP? How were they addressed? I think this is one for all three pilot states.
From Louisiana's viewpoint on this, we did have some local roads that were included in the NHS, which we did not have data on. So we are having to put together a plan to gather that information, including condition information, to be able to roll that into our TAMP. That's going to be part of our improvement process that we're going to include at the end of our TAMP. We are including all of the state-owned system in our TAMP, whether it's on the NHS or not. So it didn't add that much to our overall mileage, and we should be able to get that information in very short order.
Brad?
Yeah, this was actually a significant issue for us in New York. It was difficult to incorporate it, but we own about 72% of the NHS here in New York. We have data on all of the pavements on the NHS, but we don't have, our TAMP actually is more than the NHS because we wanted to match up with our comprehensive program. So in addition to NHS, it's all federal aid pavements and bridges, as well as all remaining pavements and bridges owned by NISDOT. So we have a substantial amount of pavement on the local non-NHS federal aid system that we've identified as a gap where we need to collect data so that we can have better planning information to feed the MPO process. And it's something that we spend a lot of time on in New York because there's about a third of the system that's eligible for federal funds that are owned by the locals. When we did our asset registry, which is the table of all the assets that are included in the TAMP, we have pavements and bridges broken down by NISDOT-owned, New York State Thruway-owned, and others, and then also broken down by interstate, non-interstate NHS, non-NHS federal aid, and non-federal aid. We show conditions as best we can and quantity of assets in each of those categories.
Kirby?
We are fortunate in Minnesota to only have 232 roadway miles of locally owned NHS, where MnDOT owns about 7,600 miles of the NHS system, and so it's just a very, very small percentage. But we have been coordinating with the MPOs because I would say most, if not all of those 232 miles are located within MPO planning areas. And the MPO planning areas are on board with the targets that we've set or identified in MnCHIP and therefore carried forward into our draft TAMP.
Okay, so the next question is from Chris Harris, and he asks, approximately how much did your TAMP development cost And he also asked, where can we get copies of today's presentation? The last one is easy. If you go to tam.transportation.org and click on the webinar tab, in a few days you will have a link to the presentation, the full deck, as well as a voice recording that is presented like a video with each of the slides. Does anyone want to share how much their TAMP development costs?
This is Michael with Louisiana. It just so happened I was asked that same question by our Louisiana division office. There's other states that are asking that question. We're putting together our costs. We're trying to estimate staff time and then our consultant time, and hopefully end of this month, first part of April, we'll have that cost, and we'll be able to share that with everybody at the Asset Management Conference.
Brad or Kirby, do you have an answer for that?
I can definitely say I do not have an answer for that.
Okay. Same for you, Kirby?
Well, I don't have a specific answer, but I would provide this kind of a direction. I would say it really depends from a state agency perspective of what you decide to include in your scope. And what I mean by that is, of course, you're going to have a scope that meets the requirements of MAP 21, but do you intend as a state to go beyond what's requested and look at beyond pavement and bridge on the NHS? If so, you're going to want to probably include a little bit more money in your scope to accommodate for that. If you are in a situation similar to New York and you have more of the NHS system than, say, Minnesota, that is locally owned, and you're going to need more outreach with the MPOs, the locals, cities and counties, and have more public involvement, then you should factor that into your costs when you're putting your scope together. So I don't have a specific answer on that, but those are just a couple of things that you should probably be thinking about from a DOT perspective.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions, and I just want to try to respect the time. So I'm just going to state that all 3 questions, and if people want to answer. The first one is from Esther Schroeder, and she asked, Minnesota, did you consider safety data in your TAMP? If so, what type of safety data did you use? The next one is from Kurt. Are the hired consultants from engineering firms or business consulting firms? And then the final one is from William Johnson. FHWA certified the development process, not the actual plan. Is this consistent with FHWA's checklist that is currently in development? All right, I open it up to all of you.
Okay, I'll answer the first question about safety data. As part of our asset management plan, we did not look at safety data. It was specifically, safety or not safety, condition-based. But one caveat is when we were putting together the risk for the assets, safety was an element that was identified as part of that risk assessment process.
The second part of that second question regards to the consultant, whether it was a business consultant or an engineering consultant. The one that we used actually is more of a business consultant, but they brought in expertise from the engineering side and specifically from asset management. So whoever you get, they should be able to tap those resources out there in the market.
And I am going to answer the part of the question related to FHWA. We have not developed a checklist yet, but we will be. And the reason we haven't done it yet is because we don't know how the final rule is going to look like. And as far as certification, Federal Highway Division offices are supposed to certify the processes that the states develop. That's based on MAP 21.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Oh, does someone else have an answer?
I was just going to say, if we have a couple seconds to support Nostron in that, the states are being required to develop risk-based asset management plans. So while it's a process that will be certified, I can see their position that whatever process you have, at the end, you should end up with something that's a risk-based transportation asset management plan. And so having some minimum definition to help division offices uniformly say the end result of this process is just that, a risk-based TAMP, should be helpful so that states are being held to common standards.
Thank you. So let's just move on to the final. Thank you to all the panelists and your thoughtful answers. All right, so our next webinar will be on June 11th of this year, and it's on approaches to integrating risk into TAM programs and plans. And hopefully by then we will know what's in the NPRM, and maybe there will be more specific issues to address as part of the webinar related to MAP 21. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our presenters. And we look forward to seeing many of you in Miami, and hopefully we'll have you on the call in June as well for the next webinar. Goodbye.